Good morning, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to day 2 of ECI's Leading Edge series, Applying Enterprise Risk Management to ESG-related risks. I want to thank FTI Consulting for kicking us off today with their continuous review and revision for ESG-related risks. And introduce Alana Fishman. She's a managing director at FTI Consulting, as well as Maurice Crescenzi. He's also with FTI Consulting.
Great, I'll take it away. Thank you, Florence. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be located. It's great to be with you. This is Maurice Crescenzi with FTI Consulting, and I'm joined by Alana Fishman, also with FTI Consulting. So just by way of introduction, a few of you may know me already, others who may not. I lead our ethics and compliance practice at FTI Consulting, which means I work across industries with chief compliance officers, general counsels, heads of internal audit, boards of directors, heads of HR, helping organizations assess and design and implement a wide variety of risk management related programs, ranging from ERM related programs to ethics and compliance programs to environmental, social, and governance programs, and so forth. I've been on the consulting side of the webcam, I guess we say these days, for the last decade, but I've spent the better part of the last 30 years in industry, and I primarily in the consumer product space. I worked for quite a long time within the Altria family of companies, which at that point in time was composed of Philip Morris tobacco and Kraft Foods. And I mention that only to say that part of my work in those years involved this sort of overlapping space of ethics and compliance, corporate social responsibility, I guess as it was primarily thought of back then, including triple bottom line reporting under the GRI guidelines, and sustainability type work, and together with ethics and compliance type of work. So during my practitioner days, I worked quite a lot in these overlapping spaces among ethics and compliance, CSR, enterprise risk management, issues management, and so forth. I'll save the rest of some of that explanation for the actual presentation because parts of it are relevant to our presentation today. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Alana Fishman for introductions as well. Alana?
Thank you, Maurice. So as Florence mentioned in the introduction, my name is Alana Fishman, and I am a managing director at FTI, and I'm based out of our Denver office. And my role at FTI is I essentially head up our ESG program, and I joined the company this past June to take on this role specifically, but I've been in the ESG space for about 7 years at this point. So I've been doing ESG before ESG was ESG, and is more towards what Maurice was saying was the corporate social responsibility side of the space. So just in the past 7 years that I've been doing this, ESG work has just transitioned immensely from what it started as to what it is today. And so my role as at FTI is to help our clients develop tailored, meaningful ESG programs and practices that fit not only their industry, but their primary goals, to help them manage the risks that they're most interested in managing, and to help them really get credit for the work that they're already doing in the space of ESG within that lens. And so we develop tailored and holistic programs to really support our client work in that area. And I think the best part about FTI is we get to partner, cross segment, like Maurice and I work in different segments, but here we are today together to discuss how our worlds completely, combine and mesh to really offer the most holistic solutions for what our clients need. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to join the presentation. Look forward to any questions at the end. So I can hand it back to you, Maurice, to take it off, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Alana. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alana. So we thought, given the topic for this session, that it would make sense to ground our discussion in a context of ERM, enterprise risk management, as the starting point. We recognize that there are a variety of ways or lenses through which to view ESG. And there are a variety of starting points when we have a discussion like this. We decided to begin the discussion with a look at enterprise risk management, really as the overarching framework for organizations to identify, prioritize, assign accountability for managing entity level risk across a variety of categories. You know, and now having been around, I guess, for a couple of decades professionally, when I look back over the arc of my career, and I think back to some of the earlier days, going back more than 20 years, maybe more like 25 years, you know, I remember the very beginnings of issues management and being tasked with doing some research to figure out what exactly issues management is and what it's supposed to accomplish. And I was one of the folks on a working team to develop, at that point in time, Philip Morris's issues management model, and you know, baking into the methodology things like likelihood and severity of impact. These are concepts now that are very, very common in the ERM space, but you know, like the very beginnings of this takes me back to issues management, where organizations were just beginning to bring some formality and rigor and methodology to identifying and prioritizing the issues and the opportunities that that were relevant to the organization, particularly with respect to stakeholders, as stakeholders were becoming more and more active, going back about 30 years now. And so that, to me, that was the very beginning of this convergence of issues management, which eventually, in my mind anyway, evolved into enterprise risk management. To a large degree, issues and risks are synonymous, and the ways about which to go about identifying and prioritizing issues and risks are also very, very similar. In an ERM context these days, we see organizations generally organizing their entity level, cross-functional, cross-business unit risks into 4 basic buckets: strategic risks, financial risks, operational risks, and then what I'll call ethics and compliance risks. Some organizations might just call that legal/regulatory, something along those lines. I think it's important to recognize at the outset that each of those 4 buckets ought to have an established and agreed upon definition associated with each one of those buckets. So for example, if we're focused on ethics and compliance risks, which is a space that I play in pretty heavily, an organization might define that category or that bucket of risks as something like an existing or emerging threat to the organization, related to potential legal, regulatory, or policy non-compliance, or other forms of ethical misconduct that, if unmanaged, could result in either civil or criminal fines or penalties, negative, you know, reputational brand damage, negative financial impact. And then likewise, the other 3 categories would also have definitions. And I think part of why this is so important is in some organizations, chief compliance officers will take a deeper dive into a compliance risk assessment exercise and go a bit deeper in a more detailed way than at an ERM level. And it's important that, to the extent that those exercises link up, and they should link up, that you're working with consistent definitions. Similarly, if an organization wants to go deeper on operational risks, disaster recovery, business continuity, succession planning, that there's also a working definition for those kinds of risks at the highest level. And so, you know, when we sort of think about ERM as a starting point and how organizations are well served to design and implement an ERM program, and not just the risk assessment part of it. I think a lot of organizations by now have gotten pretty good at the first phase of what I think of as a multi-phase program, or like continuum. Not just the risk assessment piece of it, but after the enterprise risks have been identified and prioritized, really the real work begins at that point in terms of developing frameworks and action plans to actually manage those risks in a consistent way, risk over risk over risk. But just taking a look at the ethics and compliance category for today, which is relevant for a few reasons. And first of all, this being the ethics and compliance initiative, I know most of us who are dialed in one way or another play in the ethics and compliance space, either from a law department perspective, from a compliance department perspective, from an internal audit perspective, perhaps HR, and maybe more focused on the interrelationship of ERM and ethics and compliance risk, and ultimately how that interrelates with ESG. So let's get there. Alana, if you wouldn't mind, just the next slide, please. So, and kind of drilling down from that previous slide and taking just an exclusive focus at ethics and compliance risk, I offered a definition on the previous slide that will carry over to this slide. And, we could spend a couple of hours diving into the image on the right and really fleshing out what it's intended to represent. But just in short, if we were to look at just the inner dark blue wheel, including that inner core of culture, we would count 10 programmatic elements. And in my mind, this is the framework that represents an effectively designed compliance program. And again, we don't have the time to go through it all in detail, but having a culture that promotes compliance with the law and ethical conduct, which includes tone at the top, and having organizational values, and making sure that that tone cascades consistently down through middle management and employees at the base of the organization. Of course, having the governance and oversight structure, doing risk assessments, having policies that cover those risks, and on and on and on. I think those of us dialed in today are well versed in what a framework for an effective compliance program looks like. And whether you count 7 elements or if you count 12, there are 1,000 ways to slice and dice the various expectations that are out there. I happen to organize it into 10 elements. But the point really is, in any organization, in any industry, there's an expectation to manage proactively the sort of wide variety of ethics and compliance risks that transcend the organization, function by function by function. So whether you're looking at or thinking about bribery and corruption at 2 o'clock on the outer gray ring, or discrimination and harassment, or environmental compliance, various kinds of social compliance like anti-child labor, anti-forced labor. These are all examples in my mind of ethics and compliance risk. Long gone are the days where organizations think of ethics and compliance risk as being limited just to bribery and corruption, fraud, insider trading, conflicts of interest. We look at most organizations' codes of conduct these days, they're all more or less 30 pages, 40 pages, glossy, well-formatted, plain language, and the codes tend to cover the full waterfront of ethics and compliance risks, and to some degree in a way that reflects the outer gray ring here. Again, this is not meant to represent any particular company's ethics and compliance risk profile. It's just meant to illustrate the point that ethics and compliance risks, when you think about it, that idea on a full spectrum cuts across all organizational functions, and it's not just limited to the regulatory compliance stuff. It goes well beyond that. And so if we wouldn't mind, Alana, let's go to the next slide. And so I'm trying to, string together a bit of some logic here, right? Going from ERM, drilling into ethics and compliance risks, and then taking that next adjacent step to now looking at environmental, social, and governance risk. And the reason why I opted to lay out this visual on this slide the way that I did is to really drive home the point that, from my point of view, an organization's ethics and compliance risk profile is very similar, if not identical, to its environmental, social, and governance risk profile. These are very much the same topics, right? If you think about what matters to stakeholders from an environmental perspective or a social perspective, and you were to unpack the E or the S and go one level lower, like take S, for example, things like anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, diversity and inclusion, which is related to the first example, anti-child labor, anti-forced labor, anti-human trafficking. These are all topics that are very relevant to the S in ESG, and they're also equally relevant when you're thinking about and working up and developing an organization's ethics and compliance risk profile. You see many of those same topics in an organization's code of conduct, and you also see them in organizations' sustainability reports. And to me, there's this inextricable relationship between ethics and compliance risk management and ESG issues management and risk management. It's very much the same risk profile. I think one of the important points is that the audiences are a bit different, maybe, right? Like internally, when organizations build out compliance programs, in large part, it's to manage internal risk. And so you develop a framework like this one, where you have policies and procedures and training, and you give employees speaking up mechanisms. You do testing and auditing and monitoring. A lot of that is sort of like inward looking programmatic design stuff to prevent and detect and respond to breaches. While on the other hand, to some degree, the ESG work is outward looking, and organizations will collect up data and KPIs and metrics to communicate to the outside world what it's doing vis-a-vis all of those same topics. Let's go to the next slide, please, Alana. So the last slide here is just a way to sort of try to complete the sort of thread here to show that that we can look at many of these same issues as appearing through a number of different lenses. Many of the same risks that would turn up in an ERM risk assessment would be the same risks that would appear on an ethics and compliance risk profile if you were to drill down. And then many of those same issues and risks that comprise an organization's ethics and compliance risk profile would also be many of the same, if not all of the same, issues that an organization will communicate about when communicating on its ESG performance to its stakeholders. Which brings me to the nice segue and pivot to my colleague, Alana, who will take us a bit deeper. Alana?
Well, thanks, Maurice. So I think really Maurice covered it perfectly, that our aspects of this presentation today just flow perfectly into one another. And what I loved about the prior slide with the list of ethics and compliance considerations, and then how the E and the S and the G break out, really the best way to say it, just to keep it simple, is ESG is ERM. It is enterprise risk management. It's just a very defined segment of what different considerations and metrics and risks and opportunities align to under ERM. And so, I know that we're talking about this, what is ERM and what is ESG and how do they strategically come together? I think the underlining point is they're together. They belong together. They're already the same topic and have the same subject matter, which is what we want to hone in on today. So what we see here with this slide is, we have the overarching identify, assess, control, and monitor, typical ERM language that we see when a company is trying to manage risks. And as Maurice mentioned, the number one issue that we have to do when we're looking at an enterprise risk management program is creating a risk register. Like what is the likelihood, what is the severity of your impacts? This is meant to kind of begin to show you how, similar to what Maurice just took us through, what some examples of enterprise level risk represent, and then how it just naturally falls into an ESG element assigned to, then again, the financial impact, and then the owner of what that impact would, who that owner would be. The reason why I wanted to show this is because we feel this is the exact right audience to see this slide. The leadership of the companies, you guys manage and take your companies forward with strategy and decision making. This is how ESG and ERM tie together, and this is why it's so important that the two be integrated from both a strategic perspective and an operational perspective. So if you look at the enterprise level risk, typical risk profiles are increased input costs, your ability to grow your segment in the market penetration, brand or reputational damage, and then how do you engage with investors and get access to capital? Those are just some typical things that we hear our clients talking about from a general risk perspective. And then when you insert the ESG lens now, what does that mean from an ESG perspective? There are very specific opportunities or risks that tie to that. So for example, when we're looking at increased input costs, energy and resource efficiency can account for 60% of a company's operational costs. And so if you're not efficient or effective in your resources, that can cost you a ton of money. And from an environmental perspective, energy and resource efficiency is a huge ESG topic that clients deal with. In terms of your ability to attract more customers and gain more market share, data transparency in ESG is fundamental these days. It's no longer enough to write out about what you're doing and make it sound good and compelling and environmental stewardship, all the warm fuzzies. You got to back it up with data now, which aligns to risk management. You can't say you've managed a risk when you've done nothing to manage it. It remains a risk. It's a liability for the company. It's the same for ESG. And we're seeing that, particularly with millennials and Gen Zs saying, listen, we're interested in the companies who are really promoting carbon neutrality in their products or services, or companies that are really supporting workforce engagement and human rights, related opportunities. Those are the companies that are getting bigger pieces of the market to sell their products, and they know it. Investors know it too, because they're actively shifting their capital to the companies that do those types of environmental social governance initiatives. In terms of brand and reputational damage, talent attraction and retention, anybody in leadership at a company will know this is one of the hardest areas to retain the top talent, to attract them and then retain them. So if a company's image or brand is impacted by some kind of major event or controversy, that really impacts your ability to get the best and brightest into your company. Huge enterprise risk issue. And then, of course, is the access to new capital. And I'm sure everybody who's listening in knows or feels the pain of rating agencies. There are these ubiquitous groups that have popped up who are judging you very harshly for your environmental social governance profiles. It's kind of like Fitch or Moody's, where you can get an A rating or a C rating. And ultimately, investors look at these ratings and say, you know what, this company seems too risky. I'm not going to invest in it, or I'm going to require a higher premium to get in. No matter how you look at it, the financial impacts all relate back to costs and revenue and cash flow. So this is why the C-suite cares. This is why ESG is ERM. It's because it gains the attention of the executive, the executive leadership team to say, well, we want more customers. We want to retain our talent. We want to ensure that we have investors in our, new investors coming to the company. If your ESG program is not up to snuff, that now officially impacts your risk management strategy. So moving on to the next slide, there's this awesome framework that's out there that's called the COSO framework, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations and Tradeway Commission, COSO. That's a much easier way to say it. And they were one of the first groups to essentially take all the ESG considerations and align it, pretty perfectly to what enterprise risk management looks for. And lo and behold, it's exactly the way, at FTI, we consult with our clients to say, this is what you need to do to integrate your ESG to your ERM program. Maurice discussed this, during the slides that he reviewed, but governance and culture is by far and away one of the most important aspects of this. And I'll be going through each of these a little bit more detail, so I won't spend a ton of time on this slide. But board and executive management oversight, Maurice said they needed to disseminate priorities down through, middle management and every professional level employee. If we don't have that, that's problematic. That's what mitigates risk end to end across a company. You also need to ensure that your leadership is able to make decisions related to risk management, particularly as it relates to ESG. And then, of course, we go into the culture development, that it starts from the top and it goes across to all the different functions. When you're talking about ESG and ERM, probably the most important change that has really combined the two is the fact that ESG can no longer be siphoned to the corporate social responsibility department or somebody who's just an environmentalist in your company and is interested in this. This is unquestionably a cross-functional corporate-wide initiative. You have to be able to tie your ESG risks to general strategic and operating plans for the company. Because if you don't, the why of what you're doing to manage risk gets lost, right? You don't just say that water management or climate change is important because you should. You say it because you are now able to connect it to how it impacts you financially, reputationally. You identify strategically how you're going to be building out your solutions to it. Just like in any risk register, you capture the risk and then you capture how you're going to manage to it. That's the biggest difference. And then equally as important, you capture what are your short-term wins to describe, or I'm sorry, to manage those risks. And then who are the people you need to execute against it? It's a holistic end-to-end solution. Then finally, you go to the performance of this. The COSO framework goes through identify, assess, and control. Those are pretty straightforward. And then of course, we move to review and revision. When you put a risk management program in place, whether it's ERM in general or more focused on your ESG specific issues, got to pay attention to if it's working, because there's always ways to improve, or there are things that your peers are doing, or there are things that you didn't recognize were bigger issues when you originally, deciphered what ESG risks you wanted to manage. So you have to review it and you have to essentially track and trend to how you're doing against those metrics. Are you attracting talent? Are you retaining them? Are you emitting more carbon emissions than reductions? Are you essentially getting your employees to sign off on your business ethics and code of conduct to recognize that discriminatory behaviors and bribery are bad things and that they can really sink your company? You got to essentially make sure that you're constantly on top of it. And then the final aspect of the ESG ERM sync is communications and reporting. This is where most companies begin to sync on this because you don't necessarily report out your risk register, right? As a company, that's something internal that you do. And to Maurice's point, ESG is more external facing, and that's true. Now with social media, the internet, these rating agencies, if you do not talk about what you're doing in ESG, someone else is more than happy to do it for you, and they're probably going to get it wrong, which is a huge risk to your company. You have to get credit for what you're doing. You have to speak to what your company is managing and how you're executing against those risks. Because if you don't, unfortunately, people assume the worst or they figure you're hiding something. So it's kind of a paradigm shift of don't keep your enterprise risks just kind of inside. You got to look outside and say, who would be interested in understanding that we're managing these risks and that we're doing what we should be doing? So to the next slide. Recently did a presentation where I was asked about, if I could pick the 3 things that's the most important elements of an ESG program, what would they be versus what they were maybe 5 or 6 years ago? These are the 3 that I think if anybody leaves the meeting today knowing how you manage risk, these are the 3 I'd like for you to walk away with. It's the board and executive leadership, which is what we talked about in the prior slide, governance processes, and then transparent, accurate, consistent metrics. And I'll kind of get more into these as we go through the last few slides. But why is board and executive management leadership so important? Well, first of all, boards are the stewards of the company's financial trajectory and long-term value. If the boards are not bought in to how a company is going to be allocating its financial capital, its human resources capital, how they're going to be managing risks and opportunities, that makes it much more difficult for a company to get buy-in to go ahead and do those things. But even more important than boards, which is hard to say, but it's true, more important than boards are executive management, because they're front and center in the company. Everybody sees executive management. Nobody really sees the board members. They know they exist and that they're very important. But you see the CEO, the CFO, the CLO, the CHRO. They're all front and center. And employees are waiting to understand what are our marching orders here. So if ESG is not a part of the marching orders from the top, nobody's going to do it. It's because really it takes more time out of your day. It's an addition to your daily job to change how you've been doing your processes and how you've been executing your job to fit in different elements of environmental social governance, right? So really, those two are absolutely critical. If somebody at the top is not disseminating the priorities down, you lose that value. And that's where your ERM and ESG value begins to disintegrate, because those two are connected. Any risks that are being managed need to come from the top so that every single person knows what their role is in that space. So then it's an equal pivot over to the governance processes element of it. So even for the best companies that have ESG programs, this is why this is an interesting one. We find that a lot of companies do not have a governance process to manage their ESG, which is fascinating because they have a governance process to manage their enterprise risk management risks, right? If something hits a risk register, the C-suite knows about it and they know how to make decisions, they know how to allocate capital to it. But for ESG, because it's relatively newer, if you will, this is where the process breaks down. We need to allow and support our leadership team to be able to have a consistent and transparent way of factoring ESG into every decision that impacts the strategy of the company. If there's an acquisition, how does that impact your climate profile? How does that impact your brand? How does that impact your workforce engagement strategies and program? To Maurice's point, got to make sure there's no child labor involved in that partnership or in their supply chain. That would be really bad, and that would impact your brand. What is the due diligence you're doing to make sure, as part of your governance process, that leadership is able to say, hey, ESG is a natural box that we check every time we make a decision. So that's one thing that even the best and brightest of the ESG companies that are doing this have an opportunity to improve. So just from the top, for anybody who's listening to this, start here. This is a good point to empower the leadership team to have this framework. And then also it allows everybody to pursue not all the ESG objectives, because there are so many of them, but the right ones. Sometimes programs and projects are expensive and they may not, give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of value, socially, environmentally, or even financially. Pursuing the right metrics is equally as important as identifying them and having the leadership support it. Final important aspect, and this is another huge difference than when this started a few years ago, and it relates directly to ERM. You have to have transparent and consistent metrics. Before, ESG was similarly equated to CRM. What am I talking about? We're not talking about that. We're talking about CSR, corporate social responsibility, where all you'd have to do is get a really good communications or PR firm to write something spectacular that made you feel good, that made you feel like the company's, sending money off to programs, across the world to help women's economic development was a great thing to do. And it is, but it's very fluffy language. There's no data behind it. And that's where it's all changed. You have to have transparent metrics and data behind it, which goes back to what we talked about earlier. This is where customers are wising up. They're actually now looking for that data and saying, well, prove it. Tell us why you're the best operator in oil and gas or a healthcare company or insert industry. So that's where this is coming in, and this is where it can create a liability. If you do not have accurate and transparent data, this can be a huge issue for your risk management profile. And I'm going to go through a case study at the very end that gives you an example of how this can be problematic. But if you're not setting meaningful and authentic targets and then publishing data transparently about how you're achieving those, just like any ERM project, it's going to create a liability for you. You have to show how you're managing risk. You cannot just speak to it and leave it alone. All right, moving along. All right, I think we're getting close. Yep, so developing an actionable plan. This is kind of more ESG specific than ERM, but I get this question a lot, so I figured it might be helpful just to drop it in. But if you're building an ESG program, these are the elements, and we can always share this and give anybody who's interested in these steps more of this information. But when you start an ESG program, to know where you're going, you got to know where you are. Do a program and landscape assessment. Just go ahead and look at what are your, from a holistic viewpoint, what are your strengths and weaknesses across your entire ERM program, and which of those fit into the environmental, social, and governance categories. Maurice kind of just did the heavy lifting in one of his slides. He showed all of the ERM risks and then which ones identify to ESG. A company needs to go through and begin looking end to end. Do we have an owner of that risk? Do we have a process and a cadence of review to manage that risk? Once you identify the current state of your program, you're able to identify what the areas of opportunities are as well, where you might need some help, how you might need to better manage certain risks that might have gone overlooked that can impact you financially or reputationally. It's critical to do this first step, because if you're just jumping in and trying to report out things, you're going to miss something that actually drives tremendous value for you that you may have remained under the radar. That actually happened to a client and it fell into collective bargaining. It was the concept of collective bargaining. It just kind of fell under the radar, and then they had to go ahead and speak to it to get credit for it, so employees knew what their rights were. So it's just a good example of how you got to do a full end-to-end assessment. Strategy design, this goes to the ERM piece. Once you identify your ESG risk, identify how it fits to your broader strategy. How do you allocate capital to manage this risk? What's the timing that you have to implement the solutions to these risks? If it's a quick win, get it out to the market, tell everybody what you're doing. If it's a longer term process to manage this risk, how are you going to do it? What stakeholder groups are you going to keep in the loop to ensure that they know what you're doing to manage these risks? Tell your investors, tell your employees. Your strategy is absolutely critical. And then message amplification and stakeholder engagement. So I'll go to the next slide because it's actually pretty similar. It's just breaking it out a little bit more. Message amplification and stakeholder engagement is probably one of the areas that we're trying to help companies really, tighten their ERM process. And it's because just because you do something doesn't mean anybody knows you did it until you communicate it out. And that's critical, right? And we talked about that already. So ultimately, what we're talking about here is it's not useful to put an ESG report out as part of your, annual disclosure process and then leave it to sit on the shelf. Maybe a total of 10 people will read it, rating agencies included. You've spent $1 million writing it or whatever the cost was you put towards it, and then it just sits on your website. Go ahead and project that out to everybody. Social media trends. How are you managing climate change? Who is the new female you put into the board or executive leadership? Put out a news press release about it. Talking about your ESG wins directly ties back to how successful your enterprise risk management strategy is. You have to be, as Maurice said, more external facing about your ESG risk than you would be for any typical ESG or ERM program. So that's the part I wanted to hit there. And then I want to make sure we leave enough time for Q&A. But this is a great example, and I think it ties in how ERM is fundamentally ESG and ESG is ERM. And we all leave today knowing that these are the two of the same terms, just different acronyms. So actually, even though Maurice and I work in different sectors of FTI, our worlds have collided several times, and Maurice was able to let us know that he has a client leading global food and beverage company that needed help with their ESG program, right? And by that, I mean, they had an ESG strategy out, they had a report, but ultimately their report and their general presentation of their sustainability program and ESG program was criticized. And they were criticized because essentially it was said this company wasn't being truthful about some of their commitments to sustainability. And the reason why this is really important is because, as we talked about, commitments to sustainability and data to back up how good you are as an environmental steward or social steward helps you gain customers and get market share, because it's very important to people now. So it's a huge marketing point of sale of how sustainable you are. Well, they were accused of it not being as accurate as they claimed. And so we came in and had to review every aspect of their ESG claims, go through their data, make sure that everything the CEO was saying out loud matched what they were actually doing, what their trajectory was and targets. And ultimately, we ended up finding that this company did indeed have a genuine, consistent, transparent program, but it was just enough for somebody to, criticize them, to draw all this attention, particularly from one of the big four auditors, which is one of the most interesting pivots that I've seen in ESG. Is one of the big four auditors got involved because of this criticism and because of its potential implication on their revenue if the sustainability claims weren't true. So we worked with the auditor, we worked with a special board committee to go ahead and show them step by step how this was valid. And this goes to what we were talking about before. In those three pillars, I said, if you walk away with anything, walk away with these. Transparent, consistent, transparent, consistent data and accurate data is critical. It is now to the point where your ERM program can, take executive leadership time and divert their attention away from their day jobs into managing, auditors and making sure that it's accurate. That's a huge ERM risk, and ESG fits squarely into the things that our leadership teams have to manage now. So I thought this was a good example to showcase how the two have completely come together. Luckily, this client came out on top, but just know it's critical you have consistent points of communication as you're doing your ESG program. So that's what I have. I can hand it back to Maurice, or however we're going to start the Q&A part of it. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alana. I can jump in at least in the meantime, and thank you, Alana, for your presentation here. Really interesting, and I think it plays well off of the ERM and ethics and compliance piece that came before it. And also thank you for turning the slides. I should say that because everybody knows how technologically inept I am. And if it were up to me, I probably would have been holding up hard copies of the pages up to the webcam. So thank you for doing that. So just a couple of thoughts. So first of all, I was going through the chat while you were presenting. I saw 21 or 22 comments and thought we'd have 20 questions to answer, but it looks like most of it was folks saying hello from around the world who are dialed in. So that was really great to see. Russia, Chicago, I think I saw Virginia. So welcome everybody. Hope you're finding this interesting. In terms of the PowerPoint itself, I saw a number of comments asking for copies. We haven't circulated it yet. Let us circle internally after this presentation to make sure that we can send it out or post it on the ECI site somehow. And if we can, we will. The one substantive question that I saw, and there may be others by now, had to do with marketing and advertising, and asking for more clarity around how it is or why it is that marketing and advertising would be thought of as an ESG risk. And so, let me offer my point of view on this, and then Alana, please jump in. You were talking about, Alana, in your segment, the idea and the case study that you were sharing, the food and beverage company, and the importance of demonstrating its commitment to sustainability. And, if we think about sustainability broadly across the various environmental sub-issues that would be relevant from a sustainability perspective, the variety of social issues that would be relevant from that same point of view, it's not too far of a stretch to think about the ways in which advertising and marketing play into that. I think back to my days at Philip Morris with, the sort of number of tobacco-related issues related to smoking and health and the correlation of smoking and disease. And if you think about some of the terms and conditions under the Master Settlement Agreement from the late 90s, which covered a waterfront of different business practices and curtailed ways in which, at least at that point in time, the big four tobacco companies were permitted or restricted from engaging in certain kinds of marketing and advertising tactics and strategies and initiatives, and no longer advertising to youth, no longer advertising in certain kinds of magazines that were geared toward children or teenagers, In later years, you see how these waves of scrutiny kind of go. In later years, when I was with Kraft Foods, I remember when Kraft had announced its 11 principles related to its commitment to health and wellness. And those principles more or less tracked the entire farm to fork continuum. So announcing new ways of responsible sourcing of agriculture and commodities all the way through to the end, new ways of being more transparent in its marketing and advertising and food labeling on its products to promote better health and wellness and reduce, to the extent possible, the trends related to obesity and so forth. So it's not too far of a stretch to see the ways in which marketing and advertising and truth in advertising relates to an organization's commitment, broader commitment to sustainability. Alana, would love your thoughts on that question as well.
Yeah, Maurice, I think you really hit on it. And the other aspects we were talking about, product labeling, which is such a critical aspect of it. This kind of goes from the marketing perspective, generally speaking, to what I kind of had time to allude to, but didn't get into, is the marketing is so broad, right? It can be anything from using your social media feeds to, press releases, to speaking opportunities from the CEO with critical points to mention about your sustainability program, writing an op-ed piece in conjunction with someone else, or a thought leadership piece. That marketing aspect of it for any company, whether you really don't have products or whatnot to label, that's by far and away what's missing really in the ESG space. It just gets put into a sustainability report, and that's not marketing. That's just a super long document, kind of like a 10K. Like, no, it's important to have it, but it's not what's going to get you credit for how you're, a good operator or a good environmental steward. So really, Maurice, the only aspect I have to add on to that is, as part of any ESG program or ERM integrated strategy, develop a content creation and marketing plan, a strategic outreach and stakeholder engagement plan, in tandem with your ESG program. If you don't have that, you're really missing, 50% of the value that comes through ESG and risk management. So there are ways to do that. There are strategies, but ultimately it comes down to the very basics of identify who's interested in your story and really figure out the best way to modify the language to speak to them. What investors want to know is different than what your community members want to know. Tailor your message and get it out to them in a way that's meaningful.
Thanks, Alana. Maybe we'll switch now, and you can take this one, and I can follow up if you like. But with respect to governance and governance models, what are you seeing out there? Are there different kinds of governance models at the C-suite level, maybe even at the board level, if you want to fold that into the question as well? How does the governance around ESG look? What are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So from a governance perspective, I think the number one overarching solution we're seeing is the executive team. So let's talk about the board. The board, from a governance perspective, is doing one of three things. One, they're not engaging in ESG yet, which if they're not, they will be. It's happening too quickly and powerfully to really avoid doing anymore. Two, the board is arranging themselves to create a separate ESG committee, similar to what you see on a board in terms of an audit committee or a nominating and corporate governance committee. They're actually developing a separate ESG committee that are staffed by different members of the board to provide at least annual oversight to what the company is doing, and then to engage with executives at a very, at a good cadence to make sure they understand what's going on. Or if a board is not quite comfortable creating an ESG committee, they're usually assigning ESG oversight responsibilities to an existing committee, which tends to fall in the nominating and corporate governance committee, is what we've been seeing. And then they take on the same role of what an ESG committee would look like. In terms of executive leadership governance, we're seeing that a specific executive management ESG committee is created. So what you're doing at the board level, again, you're doing at the executive level because you have direct visibility from all the employees in the company and who are watching to see how the leadership is positioning themselves. these governance committees, probably the most important thing to know is they're cross-functional. It's not just, the CEO with a few other people, from different positions in it. You have literally the CHRO, the CLO, I'm missing all my C-suite people, but anyway, we get the idea. The chief strategy officer, they're all part of this, and they have created direct lines of engagement to the different aspects of which ESG issues touch that owner, so that there's a flawless process to report up and govern the entire ESG strategy. So that's what we're seeing from a governance structure. But Maurice, if you have some thoughts to add to that, I would love your perspective.
Yeah, I see much of the same thing. This is still, although it's moving quickly, it's a hot space right now. Part of it, I think, depends on how ESG is thought about within an organization. Clearly, in the ethics and compliance space, for example, ESG sometimes is thought of as its own risk area, like the way bribery and corruption would be thought of, or conflicts of interest, or discrimination and harassment. Like when we look at annual conference agenda, sometimes for some of the ethics and compliance organizations, ESG is sort of listed as a new topic, when really it's a different it's a different lens through which to view all of the existing topics in some ways, right? Like all of the sub-environmental issues, the sub-social issues. And so to that end, like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, some of the internal programmatic ways of designing the governance structure would be very similar to how this division of compliance labor is allocated within an organization. You might have the chief compliance officer as the head of the ethics and compliance function, but certainly the CCO is not the subject matter expert for all of the different ethics and compliance risks, right? It's a cross-functional effort to drive those programs and maintain those programs across the different functional areas. And it's all of those same programs that are, I'm just muting. We've got folks who need to go on mute. Sorry, it's all of those same programs that are supporting the ESG efforts too. So from a governance perspective, there is a bit of decentralization, at least at a baseline level. How it rolls up, it could also be a team effort, like Alana is saying. We might see a chief compliance officer reporting to the audit committee on ESG because maybe the audit chairperson knows that ESG is a hot topic. What are we doing about ESG? Please include some updates in the next audit committee report, while simultaneously the head of corporate affairs or corporate responsibility in that same organization might be leading efforts to communicate to the outside world what the company is doing. So, it's a shared effort, like a lot of these risk management initiatives are. But hopefully we answered your question, and we've got 5 minutes left. Alana, maybe you could take this one too, if you don't mind, and I can jump in if need be. How much of an E from ESG applies to all companies, even if the company is a technology company? And I've got some thoughts on this too, but why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we discuss frequently with clients. So just because you're having an ESG strategy doesn't mean that there's a checklist of E and S items that naturally apply to you. Depending on your industry, you have different financial and reputational impacts that are associated with different environmental indicators and social indicators. So in the context of a technology company, which is a great example, your environmental risks are going to be quite different than what an oil and gas company's risks are going to be. So for example, for a technology company providing solutions to the government sector, I think the two most prominent E issues are going to be, where you get your power from to power data centers, and which is, we see a lot of companies like the Microsofts and the Googles moving towards renewables and power purchase agreements to get renewable energy to save, carbon emissions. So that's one area they report on. And also, water usage to cool data centers. That's another environmental aspect of it. So, but I will tell you that the primary environmental indicators, there might be one more there, but then it really falls into socials. The primary ESG risk management profile would really hit a lot of social and governance aspects for the technology industry. How do you manage customer data? How are you managing compliance? And I think that this might be a great point, Maurice, for you to jump in this area, because it really does touch the governance of data, the governance of security, a lot more than environment would.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this idea of proportionality that needs to be applied when we're talking about, how much time and resources to allocate to the different subtopics under E, under S, under G for a given company. And it goes back to this sort of hand in glove idea in terms of ESG programs and in ethics and compliance programs. And the question actually makes me think about some recent Department of Justice guidance as it relates to compliance programs, which again are the underpinnings in my mind of ESG performance, right? And the DOJ guidance memorialized an idea that had been evolving for a long time anyway, but now it's in black and white that organizations should not disproportionately dedicate resources to low risk areas, right? So like no company has endless compliance budget and endless compliance headcount. So you've got to figure out through a risk prioritization process where to dedicate your precious resources. And I think that same concept would apply in an ESG discussion as well. Like Alana's saying, if you're a technology company, you may have some very specific environmental issues and risks that you want to focus on, but it would be something far less than maybe a manufacturing company with air emissions and wastewater discharge and things like that. So we've got about 2 minutes left, and something tells me that we're supposed to hand it back to the ECI to close out and give and say thank you and all of that. So thank you everybody for your time, and on behalf of Anna as well. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Alana, for that presentation. We certainly appreciate your sponsorship of this event, as well as sharing your knowledge. And for those of you who attended and came in a little late, Maurice indicated that they'll be talking internally about what they will be sharing with the audience. So stay tuned. If you are interested in getting some of the uploaded documents on our website, go to ethics.org/events, go to our site, and you'll see some of the documents from today or tomorrow or yesterday that you can access. We will be taking a 15-minute break, and you can certainly stay in the room, but next up we have a Vault platform, which will be talking about the message, information communications, and reporting of ESG related risks. But feel free to stay in the room. You can certainly talk amongst each other. I know that